Buenos días. Me complace saludar a todas y a todos presentes, en especial a las mujeres que han llegado a Lima desde varias partes del mundo. Agradezco a las organizadoras de esta conferencia y en particular a la Coordinación de Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de las Américas y el Centro de Culturas Indígenas del Perú por la invitación para participar en esta importante conferencia. Lamento mucho no poder estar con ustedes personalmente. Me hubiera gustado poder estar con ustedes para escuchar y participar en las discusiones sobre varios temas de importancia sobre los derechos humanos de las mujeres indígenas. Pero mi presencia en Lima no ha podido ser posible. Me encuentro ahora en una habitación de hotel en Dayton, Ohio, en los Estados Unidos, antes de dar una conferencia magistral de acuerdo a un compromiso desde mucho antes de que me llegó la invitación para participar en el evento en Lima. Sin embargo, agradezco esta oportunidad mediante el uso de esta tecnología para presentar mis saludos y unos breves comentarios. Dado que los organizadores han proporcionado interpretación a varios idiomas, seguiré con mis comentarios en inglés. In my work as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I have the opportunity to regularly interact with Indigenous women through meetings, conferences, country visits, and educational activities. This interaction allows me to hear directly from Indigenous women about the challenges they face, advances they have made, and their aspirations for the futures of their families, communities, and the broader society. Within the international human rights system, there exists today a broad constellation of human rights standards relevant to Indigenous women. As women, Indigenous women are guaranteed the rights enshrined in numerous international human rights instruments that specifically address women as such, most notably the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Beijing Platform of Action. As Indigenous people, Indigenous women are guaranteed enjoyment of the rights affirmed, most notably in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Although not a treaty, the Declaration represents an authoritative common understanding at the global level of the minimum content of the rights of Indigenous peoples upon a foundation of various sources of international human rights law. As I'm sure you have discussed or will discuss, of particular note is Article 22 of the Declaration, which provides that particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of this declaration. While these advancements in international standards are significant, many of the challenges that Indigenous women face today are the same or similar to those that have been reported at numerous international conferences over recent decades. By way of example, Indigenous women continue to experience obstacles that limit their full participation in decision making and equal access to opportunities within their communities and the broader societies in which they live. In particular, Indigenous women often experience compounded discrimination that is the product of societal attitudes and practices that stifle the voices of women and undermine the rights of Indigenous peoples. I have observed that discrimination and ill treatment of Indigenous women is often present in and aggravated by the development of extractive industries and large-scale projects within Indigenous territories. As many of you are aware, over the last several years, I have carried out a study and reported on extractive industries affecting Indigenous peoples and their rights. It has become evident through information I've received within the context of the study that extractive industries have different and often disproportionately adverse effects on women. These include increases in Indigenous women's workload, increases in their vulnerability to sexual and other forms of violence, unwanted changes in gender roles, increased economic dependence on men, negative health consequences, loss of traditional land rights, interference with sites of special significance to women, and the marginalization and disempowerment of Indigenous women. On the other hand, If the development of natural resources within indigenous territories is undertaken in a manner that is respectful of indigenous people's rights, indigenous people may benefit from that natural resource development, as we are seeing in some cases across the globe. States and indigenous authorities should work to ensure that indigenous women, in particular, are free from any adverse effects of extractive industries, that they're able to participate effectively and on a non-discriminatory basis in decision-making about extractive industries within their people's territories, and that they are able to join in any benefits that come from the natural resource development. For their part, extractive companies should exercise due diligence to identify the potential effects of their activities on indigenous women and fully respect their rights. In addition to extractive industries, another major issue of concern for all indigenous peoples worldwide is violence against indigenous women and girls. Throughout my time as Special Rapporteur, I have heard compelling stories of suffering of indigenous women and girls caused by violence, as well as inspiring stories of perseverance and of steps to overcome that suffering. During my recent visit to Canada, the grave problem of missing and murdered indigenous women surfaced as a recurring subject of concern. And of course, as those present are well aware, it is not a problem that is limited to Canada. As expressed by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Radisha Manjul, in her report to the General Assembly in October of 2011, overcoming violence against women requires a holistic approach, that is, one which involves considering human rights as universal, interdependent, and indivisible, understanding violence against women as being within a continuum that spans interpersonal and structural violence, acknowledging the structural aspects and factors of discrimination, including structural and institutional inequalities, and examining social or economic hierarchies between women and men, and also among women. In a similar vein, combating violence against women and girls in the indigenous context must be achieved holistically. It cannot be addressed in isolation from the range of rights recognized for indigenous peoples in general. Related to this, combating violence against indigenous women and girls also requires remedying the structural legacies of the history of colonialism and discrimination that indigenous peoples have faced. This includes advancing the rights guaranteed for indigenous peoples, most prominently those enshrined in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In closing, it is true that indigenous women continue to face a range of challenges, many of which are related to histories of discrimination, oppression, and violence. However, in my experience as Special Rapporteur, time and again, I have witnessed the power, perseverance, and potential of indigenous women to overcome these challenges and to bring about positive change to their communities and beyond. I commend your efforts in organizing and carrying out this important conference. It is one of the many examples that demonstrate how indigenous women and their advocates are creating a future in which indigenous women are fully valued under conditions of equality. I wish all those present the best for the remainder of the conference, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of this event.